Okay, here we are. Welcome back. Welcome if you're new. Going to talk today a little bit about the end of the world as we know it. This is also, for me, this is a little bit of an experiment in technology. I'm using different streaming software so that I can include a chart on screen. And if this works well, then I may also do this in the future. Sometimes when you're talking about data, you want to show charts, you want to show the data, you want to do something. So we'll see how well this works for us. I do notice that the camera, for some reason, tends to go in and out of focus. I don't know why it's doing that. And so if it does that, at some point, you'll just have to put up with it until I figure out how to fix that. So today, talking about, it's kind of a riff on what I talked about last stream. I don't know if it was yesterday, but maybe it was a couple of days ago, about whether a couple should have children or not, and why would they want to do that, and why might they not want to do that, and got me thinking about something that I've talked about a lot here, but I've never really done the visuals about how 8,000 million people is a problem, and what it looks like and what it means to not have 8,000 million people and how we go about that. So I'm a population biologist. I know how that works. I know exactly how that works. And in fact, anybody who's a population biologist who had any training in that field or any discussion in that area will understand exactly what I'm about to talk about. Population sizes, population pressures, population collapse, predator-induced population collapse. These are all common themes in population biology. Ecosystem biology or population biology. So these are somewhat clinical discussions. We're not getting emotional about any of this. In fact, a lot of the time, the populations we're talking about in the world are, populations of rabbits and foxes. Population of bison in the Great Plains, along with the American Indians who were hunting them, and then later the white settlers who basically eradicated them. So when we talk about populations and population decline, these are very well understood models, very well understood phenomena. They've been recorded in history. We didn't even know there was a field called population biology until humans started messing around with populations of plants and animals, and eventually eradicating them. So I want to have that discussion. This is going to be a very technical discussion. This is my field. I know how this works, and I'm going to start out with an example here, and because I want something concrete. And my first example is going to be what happens to a deer population when wolves become introduced. The general phenomenon is that there's a prey species, and by the way, the deer are herbivores, and they're eating something as well. So it goes up and down the trophic levels. But let's focus on the deer. A large deer herd in a large valley. The valley could even be the size of the state of California, right? Just a big valley. Doesn't have to be small. Doesn't have to be quarter mile across. Could be 50 miles across. Could be 100 miles across. Big valley, big enclosed area. And there's a very large herd of deer. And then one day, a wolf pack comes over the mountains and discovers this untapped resource, as we like to call it. So you can imagine what happens. The deer are a food source. The wolves eat the deer. There's so many deer. The wolves never do without food. Pretty soon the wolf population grows. And as the wolf population grows, more deer are taken in the process of feeding the adult wolves, plus now the pups. And the wolf population grows. They break into additional wolf packs. The wolf packs have greater ranges. And they're more effective at hunting the deer because now there's more wolves and more wolf organization because they hunt in packs, right? So eventually they start to take a lot of deer. And if the deer are really not able to keep up with the amount of predation, then the deer population declines. Now, you can even imagine there gets to be an equilibrium between how many wolves there can be and how many deer they can eat, and eventually the population stabilizes along some some number. But you can have catastrophic collapses. You can have situations where there's nothing really restraining the wolves. Nothing at all. No disease, no parasites, no hunters of theirs, right? Nothing to restrain the wolves. So the wolves can grow their population and extend their hunting ranges and all that without bound. They can do this without boundaries. Nothing stops them. They can kill anything they want. They can eat anything they want. They can have as many pups as they want. They can have as many wolves as they want. They can have as many wolf packs as they want. The packs don't interfere with each other. There's plenty of food. It's a big range. They eat the deer. And in theory, if nothing is stopping them and they can just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce and be successful at that, then they can eventually eat all the deer. Now, in nature, that tends not to happen, but there's nothing to stop it from happening. I mean, theoretically, they can eat all the deer. So let me switch screens here to a chart I came up with. This is not real data. I generated this data myself, but I was trying to make a point. So you're looking at a chart. There are actually two sets of data here. This is a 20-year project, and you see over here on the left, we've got years 1 through 20, and the 20-year project, and I'm saying that each year the deer reproduce, the wolves reproduce, and then it's the next year. We're going to start out with a population of 8,000 deer, and the number of deer taken by wolves initially in the first year is very small. The wolves just show up. They finally show up. And then in subsequent years, the number of deer that can be taken by wolves increases. Now, there's a couple of things that are happening in this. First of all, every year, the number of deer that the wolves take increases. This is not to suggest that each wolf eats more deer. This suggests that there's more wolves. There may be more wolves. There may be more wolf packs. They may be more successful per wolf out hunting. Lots of things can combine such that every year the wolves are able to take more deer. That's the entire premise. For some reason, because of reproduction, because of better success, because of more organization, wolves are social hunters. They are able to take more deer every year. Here, where they're taking 300 deer a year, that's like one per day. Not out of the question at all. Now, the blue lines is the deer population. And it starts at 8,000. There's two axes. There's one over here on the left is the deer population. This corresponds to the blue lines over here on the left. And over on the right, there's another line. It also starts at 8,000. This is how many deer are taken by the wolves. So the left side is population. The right side is deaths. Okay, they happen to be the same numbers at the top, 8,000. But the red is deaths. And you notice that the reds are not that great. Okay, there's never quite so many deer taken that they exceed the number of deer. That wouldn't really be logical. You can't eat more deer than there are deer. But there are definitely times after the wolves have been hunting for, say, 14, 15 years, when they're taking so many deer that the population is really collapsing. Now, the wolves don't know that they're taking so many deer. They're simply feeding themselves. That's what they do. They eat, right? They're wolves, they eat. And if the deer population starts to decrease, maybe it gets harder to find deer, but they have to feed themselves. They have X number of pups and Y number of packs and so many wolves, and they just have to hunt harder. And so when their population size gets bigger, they take more deer. And it doesn't matter how many deer there are. The wolves will find ways to take more deer because they have a certain population of their own to feed. Pups and adults and packs and the whole thing. So what happens here, and this is classic population biology where you have a new predator introduced into a population. And I'll just say this for a quick reference. The predator doesn't have to be wolves. It can be anything that reduces population. So it can be deaths due to a disease. It can be deaths due to a parasite. It can be deaths due to human hunters. So the way this chart works is exactly the way population biology works as a rule. So you have the blue bar, which is the number of deer, and the predator gets introduced on year 1. And in year 1, the population doesn't even really notice that there's a new predator. I mean, some of the individual deers do because they die, but for the most part, the herd is completely unaffected when this new predator is introduced. In fact, for the first 10 years of this 20-year project, we're tracking this for 20 years. All this is made up, okay? It might actually take 200 years, but just for our purposes, we'll allow, I mean, these can be decades if you like. First decade, second decade, third decade. It doesn't matter to me. What's happening here is that the wolves start taking the deer. The population is so huge that you really don't, the population doesn't even notice. And if you were observing the population, watching the deer from binoculars, or even doing a deer survey, counting the size of the herd, you probably wouldn't even notice that there's a predator eating the deer based on the size of the population for the first 10 years of this 20-year experiment. But at some point, you are going to notice. You're going to say, wait, the deer are disappearing. Why are the deer disappearing? And then you might also notice, wait, why are there so many wolves? Okay, or why are there so many deer carcasses? And you're going to start to notice, at least, even if you've never seen a wolf, you're going to start to notice there's something happening to the deer herd. And about year 12 or 13 in this chart, the amount of deer being taken by wolves is large enough that they can start to eat a big part of the herd. And at that point, because there are so many wolves and they're taking so many deer, the fact that the population is going down, it's not going down arithmetically. It's going down basically exponentially. It accelerates. And the wolves can eat, at some point, nearly all the deer. And then the wolves themselves have nothing to eat, and the wolves leave the picture. And you'll notice down here in year 20, there are no deer taken. There are no deaths in the deer population. And there's only 9 deer left out of the 8,000. Now, that's not extinction, by the way. That's not even extirpation. Extirpation is, remember, local extinction. So if that went to 0, if the population of deer in this valley, say the valley is actually the entire state of California, if the population of the deer in California went to 0 because of the wolf population, then that would be local extinction, extirpation. If that was the only place these deer species was found, was in this valley, and they went to 0, that's extinction. Okay, that's extinction. Now they're extinct because they went to 0. Now you can still have a kind of extinction. If you went into this valley and you looked at the deer population, you saw there's, of the 8,000 deer there were before, now there's 9. If they're all girl deers, well then, and none of them are pregnant, that's important, then your population is functionally extinct. A bunch of female deer, or on the other side, a bunch of male deer, is not sufficient to repopulate the deer population because you need males and females both. You could have 8 females and 1 male, and you're not extinct. Not even in theory. You've taken a massive population crash, but you have the fixings to come back from a near extinction event. Now, it's enough. 1 male and 8 females would be perfectly fine. You could do it from there. Now, you've had a genetic bottleneck. You don't have the genetic diversity anymore. Say 4 males, 5 females. That's not much genetic diversity. And, if they're all related, then you may have a problem with, genetic diseases. And that's one of the problems that happens with populations that go very close to extinction, is that there's just very few individuals and there's very little genetic diversity in those individuals represented. Cheetahs, for example, almost all cheetahs are genetically clones of each other because at some point there were so few cheetahs. We don't even know when this happened, but I'm sure somebody does. They can date these things. There were so few cheetahs in the world. There's only one species of cheetah. That's it. There's not 50 species like there is of other types of cats. There's one species of cheetah, and they must have gone through a really, really tight genetic bottleneck, near extinction event. But there was at least 1 male and 1 female, at least. And from that, they were able to grow their population back out. So you can have populations that go to very, very, very close to extinction. But unless it's extinction, it's not, right? And then they can possibly come back from that. I mean, it could be sketchy, right? If you're close to extinction, you've got 1 male and 3 females. If they're far apart, they're hundreds of miles apart or even a couple of miles apart, and they never find each other, then, having 4 or 5 individuals in a population that never meet and never mate, well, now you're functionally extinct again, right? I got males, I got females, but they never come together, so you're functionally extinct. You're not going to have reproduction if the males and the females can't find each other and mate. So there's a lot that can happen with a graph like this. I'm not really worried about what happens when you get down to year 20. What happens after that? What happens in the year 21 and 22 and 23? A lot of the time, the population will just start to increase again. And it'll be stable for a while because, again, the males can't find the females and things aren't that great. And maybe the predator isn't completely gone. It's still around and it can still kill some of them. But eventually, maybe the population goes back up and maybe this whole cycle repeats itself. And that's also fairly common in species, is that if the predator and the prey don't actually reach some sort of a stable equilibrium, and it's never completely stable, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. But if it bounces between some fairly stable boundaries, then you can have a stable population dynamic, relatively stable. It's still going to have variations in it, and you don't have a crash like this. This chart represents a crash, and it represents a crash really of both species. There was 8,000 deer and no predators. And at the end, there's very few deer and no predators. So these kinds of dynamics don't always work out. These kind of dynamics could be really bad. And it's generally when something is introduced, suddenly something is introduced. In my example of the wolves coming over a mountaintop and coming into a valley and seeing all these deers and just doing what wolves do, eat the deer, make more wolf pups, grow the wolf pack, make more wolf packs, get very efficient at killing deer, eat the deer are gone, the wolves leave, right? I mean, that's not uncommon. It's called a trajectory experiment, where you have something that's fairly stable. There's 8,000 deer, and there's been 8,000 deer for centuries, and then you inject something, a change. You throw a change at them, you see how they do. And then you've got a trajectory, and you follow that trajectory. And this is a 20-year trajectory experiment, 20 years, 20 decades, however you want to look at it. Could even be, 20 centuries, whatever it is. It can't be centuries. 20 years, 20-year project. Now, why am I doing this? The number 8,000 may have clued you in. The number 8,000 is kind of a magic number in this scenario, in the things that I deal with. I've said a lot of times on this channel, there are 8,000 million humans on Earth. 8,000 million. There didn't used to be. That in itself has been a trajectory experiment. We introduced something into human dynamics. Our population didn't change much for centuries, verging into thousands of years. Our population changed. It kind of went up. It was going up all along, really, but it wasn't going up in the shocking way like we've seen in the last century, really the last 60 years. But there was an experiment that took place, and most people aren't aware of this, that this was an experiment. And the experiment was give humans all the energy they need to do anything they want to do. That's an experiment. Humans never had that privilege before. Humans were always limited by how much food they could get at, how much sunlight there was, how long the seasons were, how long the growing season was, which is not the same thing at all, how many hours of sunlight are there, and so forth. And about 300 years ago, we took the cap off the human population by saying, look, you've been living by the energy of just the sun. Just the sun. The sun comes up in the morning, and then there's sunlight, and then the sun sets in the evening, and now there's no sunlight. The sun is most available to you in your summertime, whether you're northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere. Your summertime is when you get the most sun. And then in your wintertime, you get hardly any at all. And plus it's cold. So there's all these energy constraints on planet Earth, given its relationship to the sun, okay? And the tilt of the Earth, and therefore the seasons. And are you in your winter or are you in your summer, okay? And given all these constraints of the Earth, Sun, solar dynamic system, the energy regime that was available to us kept a kind of a cap on human population. because you couldn't grow enough food. Or if you were hunter-gatherers, the gathering season was short. And then you had a season of harshness, right? Cold, rain, the animals are hibernating, the plants aren't growing, so you had to eat something else in the winter. Or you laid up food. You hunted all summer and then you laid up food and you ate it all winter. I don't know what they did. I wasn't there. I'm not sure that we have much of an idea at all of what they did. But they survived as hunter-gatherers, and they kind of figured it out. And the first innovation that sort of uncapped our population was when we invented agriculture. And we could grow so much food in the growing season, however short it was. We could grow so much food in the growing season that we could store food. And that meant that in the winter or any other time when food was scarce, right? Growing conditions weren't this great this year, but it's not so bad because we have stores saved up from last year. We had so much food that we could grow under certain circumstances that we always had kind of some food. And so our populations became less constrained by the lack of food and therefore less constrained by the energy balance of the earth with the sun. We invented a tool called agriculture that was better at harvesting the sun. As the sun came in and hit our crops, we could harvest the sunlight. And that's what food is. It's harvested sunlight. That's what plants do for us. We can't do that ourselves. We're not green. We don't have chlorophyll. We don't do photosynthesis. We take the food from the plants who are doing that, but they're storing sunlight. Basic biology. It's really good to know basic biology in this respect. What are plants doing? How are we taking advantage of that? We're herbivores. We eat plants. And we're also carnivores. We eat the animals that eat the plants. So we get it at however way we want to get it. So agriculture was the first thing that sort of took the lid a little bit off the human population. And so about 10,000, 8,000 years ago, our population started growing. And you can see this in the anthropological record, right? When they do cultural anthropology, they look at these great cities, right? All the Egyptian cities, places like Memphis. And of course, when they started having proper rulers, the rulers would say, oh, well, this year our population is this. This year our population is the other thing. This year we invaded a great big country, and their population was that, and their army was this size, and our army was bigger. And we beat them, and we took them as slaves, and we took their gold and their silver, and the lamentations of their women, and the whole thing. So we have some records that populations were a certain size relative to each other. Some were growing, and some were, destroyed. We know how that works, Bronze Age collapse and that kind of thing. But then there was a second experiment after agriculture was invented, and that kind of lifted the lid a little bit on human populations. The second experiment was very much akin to that. We found another source of energy. The first energy was we learned how to use plants and their ability to harvest sunlight for us, and we optimized that. We optimized how plants do that for us, not for themselves, for us. We plant them in rows. We harvest them. We take the grain. We put it in silos. We exploited the plants and their growth behavior for our benefit. And that took the cap a little bit off of our population. Then we did it again. And that was with fossil fuels. So you kind of know where this is headed, right? 300 years ago, we started using coal. And then when we realized that, wow, there's this whole thing called minerals in the ground that have these properties of being able to be burned. You can't burn just any rock. You can't burn granite. You can't burn basalt, right? You can't burn sandstone or marble. You can carve them and you can do things with them, but you can't burn them. They're not usable for fuel. And then they found this black rock. This was in the ground. Right under my feet. I pick it up and I realize it burns. How they figure that out? I don't know. Maybe a forest fire came through and set some of the rocks on fire. Wouldn't that be interesting? And so they realized on accident, you burn this stuff. And so they started digging coal out of the ground. And what taking coal out of the ground did is it further removed the lid off the human population. Because not only did we have excess energy in our food for modern agriculture, now we had excess energy for all purposes, not just eating. We had excess energy for everything. And we all know now where that went, right? It went from coal to oil to natural gas to nuclear power and all this technology. And now we use extra energy to transport ourselves and invent things. And we have pharmaceuticals now. We have all these things. And every time we find a new use for fossil fuels, we're lifting the cap on the human population. We even use fossil fuels, again, to make more food. Used to be it was a man with an ox and a plow when they were plowing the field. Well, now it's a John Deere tractor pulling a plow that's 40 discs wide, and you're making 40 rows at a time. And it's crazy, it's nuts compared to what people used to have to do. You could have 3 men with 3 oxen and 3 plows plow an acre, and it might take you all day to plow 1 acre with 3 men and 3 oxen. Now 1 man in a tractor pulling a disc behind him can plow up that field in 3 minutes. Right? It's just nuts. I mean, unless you really follow agriculture and you really have lived in an agrarian environment as I have, you have no conception of what they can do with diesel tractors and the modern equipment. Hell, I've even seen them planting the seeds, wheat or rice or whatever, using airplanes. They just fly over, and in 5 minutes it's done. They have 40 acres, it's done in 5 minutes. It's crazy, it's nuts. And unless you've ever actually lived in the countryside and you've watched these crop dusters and these seeding planes and helicopters flying over the fields, dropping rice into the rice paddies and flying away in 5 minutes, unless you've actually seen that, you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say that fossil fuels lifted the lid further off the human population until today we are at 8,000 million people. Now, changing gears a little bit, but not really changing gears. Well, it's my responsibility to tie this in for you, but changing gears for a moment. All this burning of fossil fuels and a bunch of other things we did in the past, like cutting down forests and land use changes and things like that. But definitely, most recently, burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, has lofted CO2 and also a lot of methane into the atmosphere. Methane, CO2, nitrous oxides, other things are greenhouse gases. They cause heat to be trapped near the surface of the earth. And the heat in question is sunlight. So we can't do anything about that. The sunlight comes in, it heats the surface of the earth, including things like bodies of water, heats the surface of the earth, and when the heat tries to radiate out, it can't. Because there's a blanket of CO2, methane, and other things that's trapping it. They're heat-trapping gases. That's why they're called greenhouse gases. Your greenhouse is warm. Even in the winter, it's warm because the sunlight comes in, warms the space inside the greenhouse, but the heat can't escape because of the glass. That's why you build a greenhouse. That's why it's called a greenhouse. Everything inside is green. It's warm in there. You can go in there in shirt sleeves, right? In the dead of winter because whatever, it's not cold. As long as the sun can come in, that space will be warmed and the plants can grow. It's a greenhouse. In the summer, it gets way too hot. You'll cook your plants, but that's when you need air conditioning for your plants. It's a greenhouse. So we discovered fossil fuels. Started with coal, and then we started moving into oil and natural gas. Natural gas is really hard to handle, so it took special techniques. We really needed the coal age first to build the machines and the factories and the techniques to then create the machines that can handle crude oil, and then to build the machines that can handle gas, natural gas. So there was kind of a progression. Coal launched the whole thing. Coal is enough like wood that the same technology we had in the era of burning wood and charcoal, which goes back thousands of years, that level of technology, boiler technology, fire technology, that kind of thing, was applicable to coal. So we just substituted wood and cutting down trees and setting them on fire with digging up coal out of the ground and setting that on fire. But it's all CO2 into the atmosphere, whether you're cutting down a forest and setting it on fire for your purposes or digging up coal and setting it on fire, it doesn't matter. You end up doing the same thing. So we've been doing CO2 releases for a long, long time. And then we kind of really kicked it off with coal because coal is really easy to get at. You don't have to cut a tree down and cut it up and haul it away. You dig coal out with a shovel. Men with axes and shovels, they just dig it out and they throw it in buckets. And they haul coal out by the hundreds of tons a day. Can't do that with trees. Well, now with modern equipment we can, but back then you couldn't. Back then, if all you had was simple digging tools, Digging coal out of the ground would look like a miracle to them. You're going to dig these rocks out of the ground, and we're going to set fire to them, and we don't have to go out in the forest and cut trees and drag trees around, or turn it into charcoal, which is a whole industrial process by itself. No, we don't. We just get this stuff out of the ground, and as is, just set it on fire. Really? Wow, that's amazing. And so we did it. And we changed ourselves. We changed ourselves. We changed our civilization many times. We changed how we wage war. We changed how we do agriculture. We changed how we transport ourselves and our goods. We changed how goods are shipped everywhere. Used to be, if you got a pumpkin in the fall, it probably came from your own field, or maybe a field, half a mile away. Now you buy a pumpkin, you don't even know what part of the planet that pumpkin came from. It could have come from China. It could have come from Australia. You have no idea. I mean, probably it was nearby. Pumpkins are not so valuable. We're willing to transport them thousands of miles. But the truth is, we transport a lot of food thousands of miles. And there are people who can't grow wheat or rice because of the climate is wrong, or they don't have enough technology. And yet they subsist to eat every day on wheat and rice. Where does that come from? Well, it's coming from the U.S. It's coming from, Egypt. It's coming from Russia. It's coming from Ukraine. It's coming from China. How's it get there? They put it on a boat. They put it on a cargo plane. They send it off to these other countries. They buy the stuff. They use money to do that. We take the money, they take the food, and the food traveled 1,000 miles or 8,000. And the people who eat the food don't even know that. They don't even know that happened. All they know is that no matter where they look in their country or their continent, there's very little wheat being grown and very little rice being grown. And yet they have wheat and rice and probably a bunch of other things too that they've never seen before. But now they eat and they're doing great. And now there's 8,000 million people in the planet. And if you've been on this channel before, then you'll know that I have said that the carrying capacity of this planet without fossil fuels. Now, people say the carrying capacity is not 8,000 million. The carrying capacity of this planet is 1 trillion people. It's 20 billion people, 50 billion people, 1 trillion people, okay? Well, yes, if we have unlimited availability of fossil fuels, then I guess that's probably true. Well, we can use other types of fuel. Okay, well then figure that out, okay? But right now, for the last 300 years, we've got 8,000 million people based on fossil fuels. Without that, what is the carrying capacity of Earth for people without fossil fuels? 800 million? We're now 8,000 million. 800 million? 80 million? 8 million? I guess we're going to find out, because we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Why? Because of global heating caused by enhancements to the greenhouse effect. And how's that happening? Because we are releasing excess CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, and those are both greenhouse gases. And what are we doing to release those things? We're burning fossil fuels. And why are we burning fossil fuels? For every reason. Everything you do. You have to burn fossil fuels, and that releases CO2, and that goes into the atmosphere, and that heats the atmosphere, and that heats the planet. And heating of the planet is going to cause big, 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 big trouble. Like end of the world trouble. The end of the world as we know it. What is it? TEOTWAWKI. TEOTWAWKI? The end of the world as we know it. The end of the world as we know it. And that's important. Not the end of the world. Certainly not the end of the rock, okay? The globe, the circular, the spherical rock. Okay, it's not the end of that. But it's the end of the world as we know it. And what do we know? Computers, lights, cell phones, 5G, vaccines, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we know all these things. That's what we know. That's the world as we know it. That's our habitat. We made it for ourselves. The world as we know it, humans. Anthropocentric viewpoint here, okay? We know it. Now, I have a couple of times on this channel tried to point out that we are going to have to stop burning fossil fuels. The sooner we realize that, the better. The sooner we realize that this is a disaster, that we have to run away from, the better. My common go-to is the Titanic. Maybe at first you don't think the Titanic's going to sinking. It's stopped in the water. You're not sure what's going on. The crew is running around. The captain is running around. Someone is walking around saying, be calm, be calm. And you're wondering, why am I being calm? Why should I be calm? Is there some reason why I would not be calm? And eventually, though, you figure out the Titanic has hit an iceberg and it's taking on water. And then you find out it's taking on a lot of water. And now you're getting nervous. And then you find out it's taking on so much water, they can't pump it out fast enough. And now you're really super nervous. And it's taking on so much water, it's probably going to sink. And actually, as you learn that little bit of news, the deck is tilting. And you're like, yeah, I can see that. You didn't even have to tell me it's going to sink because I noticed the deck is tilting. So what am I supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to get out of the way of this thing. You're supposed to get off the Titanic. You're supposed to go somewhere else that isn't sinking. Well, how can I do that? There's only one Titanic. If there was two Titanics and one was sinking, I'd go on the other one. But that's not how it works, right? They don't send these things out 2 by 2 in case one of them sinks and you can jump on the second one. That's not how this shit works. But look, they have little boats called lifeboats. And so what we'll do instead, since there's no second Titanic, there's just hundreds of these little lifeboats. We'll just get everybody on a lifeboat. We'll launch the lifeboats out into the freezing North Atlantic, and then we'll hope, rub our lucky rabbit's foot that someone comes along and rescues us, which is not entirely unlikely because they've already sent Morse code saying, we've hit an iceberg, we're going down. And someone says, okay, all the ships in the area that can hear this sound of my voice, get yourself to the Titanic. They're at these coordinates and everybody steam that direction. And you're going to have to take people on and be prepared to have a lot of people. And we're going to rescue these people. And that's exactly what they did. And ships showed up and the people who got to the lifeboats were rescued. And we know the story of the sinking of the Titanic because in part there were people who survived to tell us. It was not an extinction event. A lot of people died, of course. There weren't enough lifeboats. People couldn't get to the lifeboats. People were too drunk to get to the lifeboats. And of course, there were a whole bunch of people who were in the lower levels of the ship, called steerage, who bought the cheapest possible tickets. They're way down at the bottom of the ship. No windows. Of course, they get no information about what's happening. All they know, pretty much out of the blue, is that there's water pouring into their level of the ship, and they're drowning, or the ship is tilting as the water pours in, and they can't get away from it because now everything's uphill, and the water's pouring in over here, and they're trying to get up there, and they're swimming in the water, and the hatches won't open, and they drown. So those people never had a snowball's chance in hell of getting off the Titanic. Once again, the poor people die first. They get to go first. And the people who are on the top of the ship, who were in the bar and in the restaurant and dancing the waltz and listening to the music, all the people who are on the top of the ship, enjoying the view and talking to the captain, they got to go to the lifeboats. Once again, the rich and the elites and the privileged, they get away first. That's just how it is, folks. I don't know how to break it to you. Anyway, let's look at our chart, shall we? So, how does this happen? How do we do this? I have here a 20-year project. And the only real premise with this project is, and by the way, this would make a really interesting story. I may have to do this as a video, another mockumentary, another video drama on what happens every year. The premise of this chart is that over 20 years, the leaders of the world, already you're saying, this guy's nuts. All the leaders of the free world, all the leaders of all the tyrants, North Korea, China, Russia, everybody gets on board. And they say, okay, we need to save ourselves from global heating because global heating is going to kill us all, probably cause an extinction event. Not just for humans, but for most other life on this planet. So let's not have that. Instead, this is a joke, right? And this isn't going to happen, but let's say it did. Let's say we're going to give ourselves 20 years, okay? 4 times 5, 20 years to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. And that's a fairly long time given our situation right now. 20 years starting, let's say, the year 2025. That gives us until the year 2045 to accomplish the task. That's a long way in the future. And we're going to be in deep trouble by the year 2045. In fact, we're going to be in deep trouble even just 5 years into this project, 2030. But let's give ourselves 20 years. I mean, wow, how generous. But what that means is we have to reduce fossil fuel consumption every year by about 5%. Now, currently, this is kind of convenient because currently humans consume on a daily basis. Well, let's be careful here. On a daily basis, the oil-producing nations of the world produce about 100 million barrels of crude oil a day. 100 million barrels of crude oil a day. I could say that all day and you wouldn't understand what that means. 1 million barrels of crude oil is a lot of barrels. The barrels are pretty big. I mean, they're about that big around and not that tall. I think they're 40 gallons, 40-gallon barrels. That's a typical standard barrel. And $1 million a day, 100 times a day. 100 million barrels of crude oil a day. I could say that all day and you would have no idea what that means. Because it's such a huge number. 100 million barrels of crude oil a day. And that's just one of the 3 fossil fuels we consume. But let's just stick with the crude oil, okay? It is kind of the kingpin resource. So actually, if you start reducing crude oil consumption, you're also going to be in a poor position to consume coal and natural gas. The crude oil consumption, as it goes down, will pretty much cut off access to those other 2. So it's not a bad reference or index for what we have to do here. So let's say we all agree as a species to a 20-year project to reduce our fossil fuel consumption 5% a year over 20 years. And that will get us a 100% decrease in fossil fuel consumption. I'm calling it 5%. 5% relative to 100 million barrels a day. So we're going to decrease our consumption annually by 5 million barrels a day annually for 20 years. So the first year, next year, this year, we consume 100 million barrels a day all year. But the year after that, we have to reduce it to 95 million barrels of oil a day all year. And then the third year, we reduce it again to 90 million barrels of oil every day all year. And the fourth year, reduce it to 85 million barrels a day every day all year. Is it sinking in? I doubt it's even sinking in. These numbers, no one can wrap their head around numbers, okay? But now I want you to look at this chart. Year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? The human population will be largely unaffected at first. We either have, enough resilience in the system, there's enough ability to adapt. When you reduce the amount of crude oil available to make gasoline, then the price of gasoline goes up, but it doesn't go up so much that people can't buy it. And it's still at the service station. It's still at the fuel pump, so you can buy it. And if the price goes up $1 a gallon, you would buy it. So the first year, you don't really notice. Well, you might notice. You probably would notice. And someone's going to come on the news and say, well, this year, according to treaty, we're going to reduce our extraction of fossil fuels by 5 million barrels a day, and the eyes are glazing over. How many barrels a month? How many barrels a year? No, 5 million a day. Okay, glazing. Okay, so you decrease this year's production per day by 5 million barrels per day, and it's now 95 million barrels per day. And it'll go along like that, and you'll get used to hearing, this is the year we reduce our fossil fuel extraction, crude oil extraction by 5 million barrels a day again. And now we're at targeting, 90 million barrels per day, every day for the whole year. And you're like, eyes glazing over, number. I can't even think about numbers. But what happens in your built environment is that you don't have as much crude oil or coal or natural gas for the energy that it takes to grow your civilization. You also don't have enough energy to grow your population because it takes energy to feed people and clothe people and pump water to where they live and build homes where they would like to live and bring food to where they do live and make sure there's penicillin and hospitalization and schools and jobs and all these things are made possible by fossil fuels. But you're decreasing fossil fuels. You're decreasing. You're not increasing them. We're not biggering. We're shrinking. Okay, we're shrinking. We're degrowing. But at first, you don't really notice, and you certainly don't have any real excess deaths because there's not quite as much food or it's a little bit more expensive. And the first year or two of this project, maybe there's some problems in the world, but it was people that were already having problems. They just had more problems than they used to have, and so who really cares? I mean, seriously, if you can't, go someplace where they don't have those kind of problems. Brown skinned, poor person, go somewhere else. Okay, that's our attitude. For real. But eventually, and if you look at this chart, say about year 10 in this chart, halfway through the 20-year project, you're like, oh, we're halfway through 20 years. We're decreasing fossil fuels, and you barely notice. But also at that point, you start to notice that the death rate of the human population starts to increase. And why does it do that? Because people who really didn't have a self-sustaining solution for feeding themselves find themselves pushed further and further away from the food sources that are being generated using fossil fuels. There is not as much surplus as there used to be. So the surplus is what was feeding these people who are not in the core of production. They're on the edges of production. And so the food that was a surplus isn't being pushed out to these non-core, non-central, non-elite, non-rich people. And so the population of the earth begins to suffer. And that's, in this case, I was using deer and wolves and the deaths due to the wolves and the wolf population increasing. But you should also think of this as simply all the harms on the planet when you start reducing fossil fuel consumption. All the harms that people are just barely able to endure. Just take the weather for one. All of a sudden those harms become lethal. And of course, all the time this project is taking place, the globe is getting hotter and hotter because we haven't reduced our fossil fuel consumption to zero. We're just reducing it slowly from the 100 million barrels per day every single day that we're currently burning now. It's going down, but even 50 million barrels every single day, 50 million barrels a day is a lot of crude oil. And we're setting it on fire and we're using it to do things. We're not storing that. We're not sending it to the moon. We're not sending it to Mars. We're setting it on fire every day. 50 million or 100 million barrels of crude oil every day set on fire. You wonder why we have global heating? Seriously? Anybody's wondering why that's happening? It's obvious why that's happening. We're doing it. So even at 50 million barrels a day of fossil fuels, half the current production rate, okay, we're still changing the planet. Maybe we slow down a little, just, a little, by half. We've only cut our impact in half, but we haven't undone any of the damage we did, and we're still making the problem worse. Just not as bad as we were making it worse before. We've decelerated our worsening of the problem. We've taken our foot off the gas pedal, and we're looking at applying the brake. Okay, we're thinking about it. Well, we haven't actually done that. We're just not going as fast as we were. And until halfway through the project, you're only extracting 50 million barrels a day. But as you keep cutting back, then it starts to bite harder and harder and harder. And the annual death of humans goes up. It goes up really fast, okay? And that's the red line. Now, the red line in this chart doesn't look as big as the blue line, but it's cumulative. It's cumulative. If we aren't having excess births and all we have is excess deaths, then this is what happens. This is what happens. Now, my deaths column, which is over here on the left, these would be millions. Okay, I didn't put the units on here. I had 8,000 deer and 1 wolf, but this is really 8,000 million deer and 1 million people excess deaths. That means there's no excess births, by the way. Excess births are completely eliminated from this chart. I didn't want to complicate it. This is excess deaths. Net of net, births and deaths, 1 million excess deaths. Yes, there were births, but we still managed to lose 1 million people from the population, okay? And then about halfway down, about year 10, you're getting 500 million people died that year. 500 million people died that year. That's a lot of people. That's well over the population of the United States of America. Well over. And a little further down, just a couple of years after that, given the harm that we're now incurring from lack of fossil fuels and everything that comes with that, plus the worsening of the planetary conditions around us, the Earth dynamic system, with the worsening of the conditions and the lack of fossil fuels to protect ourselves from those worsening conditions. Remember, you're having power failures, blackouts, whole cities are blacked out for days at a time. You're having war over resources. One country is going to try and steal the electricity of another country, just invade their country and take over their power plant and run the wires into their country. It's going to be all kinds of shenanigans. All right? And that's only halfway through the project. Halfway through the project, we're looking at 500 million people a year dying. 500 million people a year. That's a lot of people. That's almost 2 million a day. That's getting close to 2 million a day. In fact, the next year, year 11, that is about 2 million people a day. Wow. 2 million people a day. You've never seen a disaster where 2 million people died. Never. You've never heard of such a thing. 2 million people died in the Second World War, the whole thing, right? 2 million people died in the Black Plague, the whole entire thing. Took years, took a decade. We're talking about millions of people, a day, such that it adds up to 700 million a year. These are numbers that boggle the mind. But as we are forced to engage in this process of ratcheting down our access to fossil fuels because we must, or we will face essentially an extinction event. If we don't ratchet down our access to fossil fuels over a 20-year period, and 20 years is being very generous, by the way. I could see this being forced to be 10 years. I could see us being forced to do this in 10 years. But let's say we give ourselves 20 years, and it's only 5% a year. And 5% doesn't sound like much. It's 5 million barrels a day that we ratchet down. So instead of 100 million, it's 95 million. Instead of 95 million, then it's 90. It's still a lot of millions. Instead of 90 million, it's 85 million. That's a lot of millions. I can't even think of 85 million anythings, right? After that, 85 million becomes 80 million. We just keep ratcheting down by 5 million a year, 5% of the current consumption rate. And after 20 years of reducing by 5 million barrels a day, you get down to zero, essentially zero. You've gotten rid of all your hundreds of millions of barrels a day. You went from 100 million a day to 0 million a day in 5 million barrel increments. And it took 20 years. Simple math, arithmetic. So a 20-year project of just reducing fossil fuel extraction, because you're extracting gas and you're extracting oil and you're extracting coal. They're different processes, but let's just call it that, extraction. By reducing fossil fuel extraction by a set amount every single year until you get to zero, then you've stopped burning fossil fuels. And what have you had to do during that time? Well, you've had to find other forms of energy. Remember, this was all about the energy. We don't need the coal for coal. We don't do anything with the coal except set fire to it. Why do we set fire to it? Because we want the fire. That's all anybody wants from coal is the fire. That's it. What is coal good for? Nothing. It was never a precious stone. It was never used for jewelry. It was never used for decorating yourself. It wasn't used at all for anything. And then one day, someone discovered it burns, and then it was used for fire. That's it. That's all we've ever used coal for is fire. Pretty much. It's also used in steel making, but you know what I mean. And crude oil, crude oil was toxic. Animals fell in it and died, had no use for it. And then we realized it burns. And we said, oh, wow. So in addition to having olive oil that we can burn and animal fat that we can burn, we have this black goo that comes out of the ground for free that we can burn. So we'll just collect that and set fire to it. We never cared about crude oil except the fact that it could burn. And later on, we discovered uses like plastics and whatnot, but that came much later. Oh, and by the way, we still burn the plastics and we're done with them. So it was the energy. It was always the energy. We use the energy for doing energy things. And by the time you get to 0 millions of barrels of crude oil, and of course all the other things being extracted from the ground, what are you going to use for energy? Well, one guess is you use nothing. Now, the techno-optimists will say, well, we can use fusion, we can use nuclear over the types, we use solar, we can use wind, we can do all these things, all of which are dependent on fossil fuels How do you build a fusion reactor? Using fossil fuels. How do you build a solar panel? Using fossil fuels. How do you build a wind turbine? Using fossil fuels. It even contains plastics, okay? So you're going to have fossil fuels to build these things that are going to save you from fossil fuels. Really? That's going to work? Well, what if we don't allow for that? What if we simply say, no, we're not going to take any fossil fuels out of the ground. Figure out another way to make wind turbines. Figure out another way to make solar panels. And you can't. What if we never figure it out? Nobody wants to. Nobody cares. Well, okay then. You got a problem. And your problem is you never bothered figuring it out. Because you didn't want to. Because you didn't think you had to. Because it wasn't important. Whatever the problem was. So what you take away from this chart, and this chart is population dynamics. I made up the data, but this chart will be readily recognizable to any population biologist. What this chart tells you is in the early days of your trajectory, okay, you don't really, I wish we wouldn't do that. You're not really seeing big changes in your population. In fact, you could even say in the first 10 or 11 years, you don't really see big changes in your population. But then it all happens at once. And that's the nature of these things, is that as you continue to just methodically remove your dependency on fossil fuels, you get to a point where it just becomes a dumpster fire. And that's the point where you realize that you were more dependent on these things than you knew. And if people start saying, well, we'll just reduce by 5 million barrels a day every single day for a year, maybe that doesn't sound like much. You're extracting 100 now, taking away 5. It's not, the math isn't complicated. But at some point, when you remove 5 million barrels a day, but you're only taking out 20 million barrels anyway, that's a big reduction. And people start to feel it. And I'll tell you, there's actually a secret here. Even though this chart shows a kind of monotonically decreasing population of Earth, and that's what this is. This isn't deer. This is humans by the millions, okay? 8,000 million to 7,169 humans by year 2 or year 10, and then by year 20, 9 million humans. These are millions of humans, okay? At somewhere in year either 18, 19, or 20, we get down to a number that this Earth, as it is now, with all the harm we have done, which is extensive. I mean, you'd have to be a biologist to understand what the word extensive is. Extensive is doing a lot of work here, okay, folks? Extensive damage to the Earth. That sentence is doing a lot of work. And if you're not a biologist, you wouldn't even know how much work I'm doing with those 3 words. Extensive damage to the Earth. 4 words, okay? There's a lot packed in there. There's a lot packed in there. And we could spend all day talking about what those 4 words mean. Extensive damage to the Earth. What it means in short is you have no natural habitat at this point. You don't. You do not. There is nowhere for you to go. You might as well go to Mars. No joke. You might as well build a colony on the moon because you got nothing up there. You got nothing on Mars. And honestly, without fossil fuels, you got nothing here. We screwed the pooch. We absolutely fucked it up. We totally fucked it up. And by the time we get off the fossil fuels and all of the worked environment that we have built using those for the last 100 years, certainly in the last 60, by the time we get off of fossil fuels and that worked environment begins to collapse under its own weight for lack of maintenance, if not other things like all the things the Earth is doing to us, the floods, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, I mean, that's causing damage. But without fossil fuels to repair all that and get it all working again, then you won't have it. You won't have it. The hurricane will come through your town, knock everything down, and you'll say, please, government, come by with your FEMA money and repair my town and my businesses and my homes and everything. Please give me a new home. And they'll say, no, I haven't got any money. And we don't have fossil fuels anyway. We're reserving our fossil fuel consumption for the U.S. military because enemies are trying to come here and take our whatevers, and or maybe worse still, we're going into other countries and taking their whatevers. Okay, that's probably what's going to be happening. We're the invaders now. We need our military to be army strong, whatever, and they need to go into Mexico and take all the shit. They need to go into Canada and take all the shit. Thank you, Canada. Shut up. And we need to get all the shit for us, and we want all the things, and we're going to be the winners. And yeah, that's how the army actually works for you. It works for you. Yeah, we become the Mongol horde, right? Scouring the world for the last of the resources because fossil fuels are going away. Another reason why they'll never do that. But, they'll have to do something. Yeah, about the time we get down to the end of our experiment, years 18, 19, and 20, there are so few humans that maybe the Earth, as it is now, with all the harms and all the screw-ups that we've managed to impose on it, might be able to support that few people. 9 million people left on the Earth, that's a lot of people. Are there 9 million African elephants? I doubt it. Are there 9 million gorillas? No. Hell no. Is there 9 million of anything our size on the planet? No, I doubt it. There's not 9 million of anything our size that does the things we do and requires the habitat we require. There's not million, they're not, so even at 9 million, we are probably super abundant, super successful. Nowhere near extinction. But look what happened to that blue bar. That's what's called a die-off. That's a die-off. That's math. That's all it is. It's just math. It's not me being in there and doing terrible things. This is population dynamics. Excess deaths. The red line is excess deaths. And if it just continues, and it would for 20 years, if we're cutting back fossil fuels every year and not bringing them back, and we can't replace them with anything, then we just don't do the things that fossil fuels used to do for us. Like grow food or pump water, transport water thousands of miles. We just can't do those things anymore. Vaccinate everybody against the Black Plague. We can't do that. So when the plague comes back, which it will, because it never went away, we just keep the Black Death, in a bottle. It's in the natural population, and when there's no way to treat it and no one to do the treatments, because there's not enough fossil fuels to get people to hospitals, not enough fossil fuels to keep hospitals open. There's nothing. The worked habitat is completely collapsed at about year 10. About year 10, the worked habitat is gone. It's just gone. 50 million barrels per day of fossil fuels is a lot of fossil fuels, but it's half of what we have now. And you can't really support civilization on half of what we have now. And we have to go to zero. Not half, not a quarter, not a tenth, zero. Zero is the number. Zero is the actual number. Now, in this experiment, this 20-year experiment, we choose to do that. And this is the result. And if you ever ask yourself why the elites and the leaders and the thought people and the big brain people are not doing this, why won't we stop burning fossil fuels? They should just stop burning fossil fuels. Leave the fossil fuels in the ground. They know this is how it works. They see this chart. This is the first thing. Every time they sit down together to talk about ending fossil fuel consumption, someone trots this chart out. Before we get started, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, and they put it up on the projector, this is what we're up against. Yep. And they all look at each other. Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Yep, you're right. That's what we're up against. Okay, we're not doing that. We're here to talk about, weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels. Oh, well, we can't talk about that because we can't do that. Because that would be insane. But you have to do that. That's the project. We don't have any other projects. You think we do. We're going to innovate. We're going to invent. We're going to be just. We're going to be equitable. We're going to do all these things. I have all these projects. All, unicorns and rainbows. No, those are not projects. Those are not your project. You have a 20-year project to reduce our human consumption of fossil fuels. And if you can manage it, our reliance on fossil fuels, which is a big ask, by the way, because that's our entire worked habitat, is made on fossil fuels and maintained and continued on fossil fuels. So becoming independent of fossil fuels, wow, that's, yes, excuse me. Well, we can't do that. But we're going to have to. And if that's like, you keep saying that, we're going to have to. Yeah, that's right. That's right, we're going to have to. And one of these days, when all the good and the great get together and they're having their annual conversation, it's called the COP, the Conference of the Parties, right? They're going to get together and they're going to have their annual to-do. And who knows where it's going to be held? Maybe they'll start holding them in Antarctica because that's the only place that's left that humans, it isn't on fire, right? They'll hold one of their COPs in Antarctica or Greenland, right? Because it's not on fucking fire all the fucking time. So they'll show up and someone will say, thank you for attending, ladies and gentlemen. As usual, as per our traditions, we're going to start with this chart. Here's the 20-year project to wean humans off of fossil fuels. 5 million barrels a day, starting in year 1 and continuing for 20 years until it's 0 million barrels a day of fossil fuels are extracted. And here's the population of the earth in blue, and here's the excess deaths in red. And we always put this up at the beginning of our conference so we all remember what we're supposed to do and what the challenges are. And here it is. And now let's talk about whatever we're going to talk about. And someone's going to raise their hand. They'll say, excuse me. Yeah, I know. I've seen this chart nearly my entire adult life because I've been coming to these things for 40 years. 30 years, 20 years. And yeah, it's very scary. And it looks horrendous. And that blue bar, at least on that chart, it looks like, to me, it looks like it goes to 0. I know you're telling me it doesn't go to 0, but it looks to me like the human population goes to 0. And that's sucky. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? We have to do this. This is now the project. And there's going to be this murmur that goes up around the crowd. Maybe there's 300 people in there, and they start looking at each other and murmuring and whispering. And it's like, yeah, you know I'm right. We have to do this now. We have to do this. And by the way, giving ourselves 20 years, this late date is like crazy generous. We should have started this project 20 years ago. We should be at the end of this project right now. We should be at 0 million barrels per day of crude oil extraction. And we haven't even started this project. And now we're going to try and do this project. And this is, we've waited too long, and we can't wait any longer. Now we have to do it. And the 20, 30 times I've seen this chart thrown up in front of the crowd at every COP, Conference of the Parties, and we have our traditional laugh at this chart, and then we talk about something else, like economic growth and growing jobs and equity and all this other bullshit, after we talk ourselves into a circle and kiss each other on the mouth and swap our wives and go home to our home countries. Okay? And we don't do it. Now, here it is, further on, and, look out the window what's happening to the planet. We can't even have our COPs anymore in Australia and Switzerland and Spain, because they're all on fire. We have to have our COP meeting in fucking Greenland. Oh, and by the way, my jet, as I was flying over Greenland, they pointed out all the ice is melting. So how many more years can we even have it on Greenland before the sea level rises and buries all these villages that we've built on the shores of Greenland so we can have our meeting? We're going to have to move inland on Greenland just to have our stupid meeting. So leave that chart up there. Let's look at this. Let's talk about this chart. Ladies and gentlemen, let's spend the rest of this week not eating well and talking about our grandkids. Let's spend the week talking about this chart. How are we going to do this? Ladles and germs. How are we going to do this? Yeah, one of these days. They're going to put this exact chart. I just drew it for you. It's going to look just like this. They're going to put this exact chart up. They're going to say, okay, that's it, huh? That's the roadmap. And every year is a 5 million barrel per day reduction in crude oil extraction and all other fossil fuels in like manner. Every year, 5 million. Every year, 5% from current extraction levels, I see. For 20 years, that's it, huh? And that blue line, that's the deal, right? Yep. Well, we probably don't need 5 days to discuss this, do we, ladies and gentlemen? This is it. We've been looking at this chart for 30 years, doing exactly nothing, exactly fuck all. We've been looking at this chart for 30 years. Well, figure out what you have to do to make those reductions in fossil fuel consumption. Figure out what you're going to tell your people when you're going into economic contraction. Figure out what you're going to tell your people when the food becomes expensive and the fuels become unavailable because of all these reductions in fossil fuel extraction. Maybe that's what we're going to talk about for the next 5 days. How we're going to message our people that this chart is a thing and that blue line is people. This chart is a thing, and those blue bars are people. And at the end of a 20-year project to get us off of fossil fuels, at the end, you don't see a blue bar, do you? You don't see a blue bar. You actually have to go to the data to even find the number. Because on this chart, at this resolution, that blue bar is gone. Is gone. That's what's happening now. That's where we're headed. We're headed to gone. Because without our built habitat and our fossil fuel extraction and our biggering and our growering and our jobs and our equity and our justice and our everything else, this is what you get. And we have to do this. We have to do this now. I don't know how else to say it. I keep saying it over and over and over again. We have to do this. And I'll say it again. If we don't do this, it will be done to us. The planet will get so hot that you won't be able to pull coal out of the ground. You won't be able to drill for crude oil and put the crude oil in the pipelines and refine it and distribute the refinery products. You won't be able to manage natural gas. It'll be so hot, no human can do it. No human can fix the oil rig. No human can drive the truck. No human can work on the valve on the pipeline. No human can do it. So they won't. And even if you had spacesuits for people to wear with cooling backpacks and all the other things to keep them from dying in the 140-degree surface of the Earth, they won't want to do it. They're going to be trying to get their families to a safe place. They're going to be trying to get to Greenland. They're going to be trying to get to the Arctic Circle. They're going to be trying to get to Antarctica. They're going to try and figure out how to grow their own food, because at some point it's going to be uninhabitable. The surface of the Earth will be uninhabitable. And what does that mean? It means if you're on the surface of the Earth, you die. That's what that means. The surface of Mars is uninhabitable. You know, I've listened to Elon Musk and all of his dreams of conquering Mars. The surface of the Mars is uninhabitable. It will always be uninhabitable. You have to live in a dome. You have to live with air conditioning, heating, and cooling. You have to live with particle filters. You don't want to breathe the dust on Mars. It'll kill you. And when you go outside on the surface of Mars, you have to wear a spacesuit. Mars is uninhabitable. Mars is uninhabitable. Mars will kill you if you don't have a built habitat. And the surface of the Earth is going to become uninhabitable. The surface of the Earth will kill you if you don't have, a spacesuit with reflectors and cooling and backup systems and batteries and air cooling and air filtering. It's just like being on Mars. The surface of the Earth will become uninhabitable. It'll be too hot. It'll be too hot. It's already too hot in thousands of places that people live. Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, the entire Southern California. Right now, it's 120 degrees in Southern California. I can't even believe that. It's uninhabitable. If you had to be out in it, you would die. You would die. If you had to be in it, you would die. So where are you? You're not in it if you're in Southern California, because Southern California is uninhabitable. You're in your air-conditioned house, your air-conditioned car, your air-conditioned mall, your air-conditioned parking structure at the mall. You're in your air-conditioned bus. You're in your air-conditioned commuter train. You're in your air-conditioned airplane. If you had to go outside, you would die. Certainly you would die if you're working the crops, working in the fields, trying to eke out an existence for, create food for yourself. You would die. It's uninhabitable. And just imagine when the Earth, the entire Earth, certainly around the equator, half, maybe 2/3 of the inhabitable surface of the Earth, meaning not on the water, when 2/3 of the habitable surface of the Earth, the land, is 140 degrees every day, or at some point during the day, and 120 degrees at night, it's uninhabitable. It's not as bad as the planet Venus. It's not as bad as the surface of the sun. But it doesn't matter. It's sufficient to be lethal to you. Scorpions, maybe. Rattlesnakes, maybe. But not you. You're gonna die. And so you have to live in a dome. You have to live in air conditioning. And God help you if the air conditioning ever fails, which it will do, because most of your power, the electricity to run your air conditioning and deliver your food and keep the food cold in the truck and keep the food cold in the store and keep the food cold in your home and everything else is done with electricity. And once we start cutting back on fossil fuels and the coal and the natural gas and the oil and everything else that makes electricity for you, you're not going to have any. And for what, an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 4 hours a day, you don't have any. And how many days can you stand it when you don't have electricity to run your air conditioning all the time? Yeah, then people start to die. Then it's not too far down the road when, because of failures of our built system to support human life, you get 2 million people a day dying. It won't even be in the news. It'll just be this thing that happens, and who cares, right? Most of it's happening in India and China and Africa and, Greece and Spain and places you can't even find on a map. That'll be where people die first. 2 million a day. Well, 2 million a day all year round is 700 million people a year. And 700 million people, that's more than the population of the entire United States of America. Quite a bit more. It's almost double the population of the United States of America. Every year. Excess deaths. And when you have an entire United States of America dying every year, well, you're on your way to 9 million people total left in the world. And, these numbers, these excess deaths that I have in this chart, it's easy just to ignore this kind of stuff, but these are actual numbers that I put them in, but I gave myself a project of getting down to zero fossil fuel use over 20 years. And at the end of that time, we are living without fossil fuels. And we get down to 9 million people, and maybe this planet without fossil fuels constantly being used to keep us alive, electricity and air conditioning and transportation and John Deere tractors and all that, maybe 9 million people can live on this planet. Maybe. Probably. I'll allow for it. But they're not going to be, 9 million poor people. They might be poor at that point. But in order to survive this 20-year project, you're going to have to start out in year one as a millionaire or a billionaire. And then it's going to take all the work you can do for 20 years just to stay alive. It's my guess. Without fossil fuels. You're going to have to steal somebody else's stuff. You're going to have to steal all the food that's available in the world. You're going to have an army. You're going to have to send your army out to find food and water and bring it back. And then when your army is done finding those things for you, you kill them so they don't have to have their part of the food and the water. It's just going to be brutal beyond belief. It's just going to be one step removed from cannibalism. And I wouldn't be too surprised if somewhere around year 10, cannibalism becomes a thing. There's lots of ways to die in this scenario. As we go from 8,000 million to 9 million, lots of ways to die. And they all have to do with the destruction and demolition of the worked habitat. We are so dependent on this. And it so has to go away. It so has to end. And if you think that you can find a way to keep modernity rolling without fossil fuels, then you should just do that right now. You should drop everything and do that, because that's what's going to keep people alive. If we can find a way to survive without fossil fuels, because right now we don't. Right now we don't survive without fossil fuels. Electricity is 20% of energy consumption around the planet. What is it used for? Right, server farms, internet, lighting, air conditioning, some transportation, not much. Electric cars, no electric trucks, certainly no electric airplanes. Just a tiny fraction of private automobiles are electric, and the rest of it is lighting, server farms, internet. That's about it. Electricity. And 80% of our energy consumption is fossil fuels. And that's doing the important stuff, right? Growing food, harvesting food, moving irrigation water, hundreds if not thousands of miles, transporting food, processing it into different types of foodstuffs, big ag, big pharma, big auto, big energy utilities, processing sewer, processing fresh water, delivering these things to your home. Turn on the tap, there it is. Hit the light switch, there's the lights. All this stuff, deliveries of all these things, and manufacturing all of this infrastructure, keeping the infrastructure working, is all fossil fuels. All of it, 100% of it. There's no oxen in there keeping all this working for you. The guy that comes to, fix the power pole in front of your house after some retarded drunk person runs into it and shears it off with the ground and leaves you without power. The person that comes out here to fix that, it's a team. It's like 8 guys in 3 trucks. And they bring a big power pole with them and a big crane, and they're doing all this work putting this power pole back in. And I've seen it done. Because our power poles get knocked off at the ground level all the time. And it's a big deal. And you don't have power for a couple of days while that's happening. Well, what happens if those people can't show up because they got no fossil fuels? Or they're only doing that kind of work for people who have a lot of money and have a lot of political pull and have a big loud voice. And so they have to service those people first. And they have problems with their power. So the crews with the last of the fossil fuels are making sure that the elites, the politicians and the economists and the professors and all these people, that they have the last of the everything. And are they going to come to your little suburb on the outsides of some podunk town in the middle of a desert? No, they're not going to do that for you. No. They're not going to do that for you. So somewhere along this blue line, somewhere along this set of blue bars, you drop off. It's your turn. Because the fossil fuels, whatever was left, 50 million barrels a day, 20 million barrels a day, whatever was left, is not for you. Not for your food, not for your energy, not for your pills, not for your surgical treatment, not for your kids, not for your lighting, not for your water, not for your sewer treatment, not for you. For somebody else who's more important than you. Probably. Now, if you're American, you're automatically more important than everybody else on the planet. Okay, good for you. You won the lottery. But overall, if this is right, and we get down to 9 million people, because that's about the carrying capacity of this planet right now, as fucked up as it is, plus 20 more years of global heating, seriously? How many people can live on a planet that's 120 degrees all the time everywhere? And then someplace 140? How many people can live on a planet like that? Well, they can't live in Phoenix, Arizona. They can't live in Arizona at all anywhere. They can't live in Texas anywhere. They can't live in Southern California anywhere. Any part of Southern California. 20 million people live down there. They can't live there. Where are they going to go? I don't know. Probably nowhere. They're not going to get fossil fuels. Now, they'll get them ahead of the Africans and the South Americans and the Mexicans. But eventually, when the chips are really down and we're down to 10 million barrels a day being extracted, because that's the program, that's the project, then those 20 million people in Southern California probably don't get any. And there'll be some other part of the planet, some other group of people that's getting that last of the fossil fuels. And it won't be those people. They have to get out. And if they have the means to get out, then they get to be in the place where the people are that are important enough to get the fossil fuels when they're down to 10 million barrels a day. And when they're down to 5 million barrels a day. But then eventually it's at 0 million barrels a day. And who's getting fossil fuels when it's 0 million barrels a day? 0. Nobody's getting any. And what are they doing? I don't know. How are they living? Beat me. I have no idea. Are they going to figure it out? I don't know. Who's going to figure it out? No idea. Is anyone talking about figuring that out? Not that I'm aware of. And yet we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to do this experiment. We're going to have to go this path. This is our 20-year path. There's a year 1 for this path. There's a year 1 for this project. I don't know when it starts. I don't think it's 2024, but it might be 2025. There could be a 20-year project that they're talking about right now. Every year at the COP, every year at the COP, they come together and they throw this chart up and they say, well, is this the year that we start this? And everybody's mumbling, I don't know, stroke your beard, scratch your cheek, I don't know. Can we wait? Well, this is the project. You want to wait? We don't want to talk about it this year? Okay, we won't talk about it. Let's talk about our grandkids. All right? And so that's what they do. Well, one of these years, they're going to look at the chart and they're going to say, well, scratch my chin, no, I don't know, stroke my beard. I guess we got to do it. All right, let's talk about how to message this to the people. Or do we even bother? Let's talk about how not to message this. Let's talk about how to cover this up. We're going to do this. Let's talk about how they don't ever find out that they're going to be killed. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how the media can't ever know this is happening. How it can never be demonstrated in any way through population census numbers or anything at all that this is what's happening. That when entire towns die because of a week-long power failure, we have a plan to how to cover that up. We send it in the Army, we put up the concrete barriers, we park a tank at every major road in, and we say, yeah, there's nothing to see here. Leave, get out. You're not allowed here. And after a couple of years, when people stop coming back, you can take the tanks away and go to the next city that has just died, where everybody in it is dead. And, put up the concrete barriers, park the tanks on every major road in, and say, no, you can't come in here. Nothing to see. Nothing happened. Everybody here is fine. Go home. No, we don't need news here. And stop flying your drones overhead. There's nothing to see. No fly zone. Go away. Go home. It's a felony to be here. It's a felony to report this in the news. Nothing happened here. It's treason. You can't do that. We'll shoot you on the spot. You got a camera? We'll shoot you on the spot. Don't come here. That could be how they handle it. Maybe whole countries are allowed to die. Whole entire nations are allowed to die. No one gets in, no one gets out. Put tanks and troops on the roads in, close all the airports. Yeah, nothing to see here. Nothing. No, and no, you can't fly over either. We got air defenses inside the perimeter. If you fly over with a jet, we shoot your jet down. Everybody in it. Everybody dies. Don't fly over this area. There's no fly zone. On penalty of death. Don't fly your drone in. If we catch you flying a drone in, we shoot you. Penalty of death. Can't come in this country anymore. How are they going to do it? I don't know. They're going to have to figure it out. This is their project. This is the project. This is the project of ending our reliance on fossil fuels. This is the project. And in the end, it's just population dynamics. Deers and wolves, all the things. Population biology. That's all this is. Take away the crude oil and we're just a population of animals trying to find water, food, shelter, defense, peace. Take away our fossil fuels and we're just deer. Well, of course, we're also the wolves. So we got that going on. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks for coming. If this works out, maybe I'll do this again someday. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you like pretty charts, leave a comment and let me know what else you'd like to see me talk about.